the source of this mitzvah, of this requirement of the davening.
Is that the right amount of?
And the Gemara brought these proofs, and each one, it said it's not really a proof. And finally, the Gemara brought a verse, Ivdu as Hashem b'yira v'gilu berado. Serve Hashem with fear, and gilu berada means rejoice with trembling, trepidation. And so the Gemara said, you see from here about that you're supposed to serve Hashem, which means davening with fear. And then the Gemara asked, okay, very nice, but what about the end of the verse? How do you translate the end of the verse? V'gilu bera'ada, and rejoice with trepidation. So you daven with fear. What does it mean in the end when it says rejoice with trepidation? So Tosfos over here mentions, he says, how do you read it? What's the simple meaning of that verse? And the reason why Tosfos is bothered with that is because if you read the verse simply, serve Hashem with fear and rejoice with trepidation, it doesn't seem to flow. If we're talking about serving Hashem, you serve Hashem with fear. So it doesn't seem to be connected to serving Hashem when it says rejoice with trepidation. So Tosfos says the translation of the verse, the pshutoi shel mikra, is serve Hashem with fear. If you serve Hashem and if everything you do is with fear, then when the day of trepidation comes, you will be able to rejoice, which is a nice insight, which means if you prepare yourself well, you don't have to worry about Yom Kippur. Who are the people who are afraid on Yom Kippur? It's those that are not prepared in advance. But if you serve Hashem with fear all year long, then on the day of trepidation, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and other days of trepidation, you could be v'gilu, you could rejoice on such days because you've served Hashem properly. And that's the simple meaning. In other words, that's the flow of the verse. Serve Hashem with fear, and then when the day of trepidation comes, gilu berada, you can rejoice on that day. You don't have to worry so much. Yes, Susan.
When you say serve Hashem with fear, is there another translation besides the word fear?
So it's interesting you bring that up. There are many different levels of fear, and I think we've touched on this before over the past year. We've touched upon different levels of fear. There's fear of punishment, awesomeness of God, feeling awed by the presence of God, the greatness of God, and so
it's not really that I'm afraid of Hashem. What I'm doing is showing showing him that I know he is the supreme.
Right.
He does everything.
Correct. That he.
Okay.
You are awed in his presence.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Robert. No, you're muted.
Okay, sorry, everyone. You said at the very end the word awe, but the translation in the art scroll is not fear, but awe itself. So serve Hashem with awe and rejoice with trepidation. So awe, there's a different nuance than fear to awe, all right? And that's very valuable to understand. So it is something beyond our imagination of Hashem's greatness, and we accept whose leadership we live by.
If that's the case, then the word should be yira, yirat shamayim, awe of heaven, yirat shamayim v'yirat chet.
Ivdu es Hashem b'yira. It does say serve Hashem with yira. That's the verse that we're explaining. But I guess you're asking why does the Mishnah say kovet reish? Is that what you're asking?
What I'm saying is that that I agree. The better translation is awe.
So the translation of fear is not wrong. There, it says that when a child is taught to serve Hashem, he's supposed to feel the fear of punishment. In other words, that should be his initial. You give him rewards. You explain to him the concept of punishment, and when a child is taught, that, or when a person is on that level, they that would be a level of yiras ha'inish. It's brought down in many books of Musar Sfarim and books of self-refinement and Jewish holy books of refinement called Musar Sfarim. It's also brought in Hasidic books that there are two general levels of fear, and the yiras ha'inish, the fear of punishment, is a level where
and then there's Ovdu Hashem B'Simcha.
Yes. Now, so our Gemara is trying to explain the Mishnah, and the Mishnah said, "Serve Hashem with kavod." You daven. You don't start davening unless you have kavod roish. And Rashi said it means hachna'ah. And so we've been trying to translate, what does this mean, hachna'ah? And the Gemara seems to translate it to mean fear or awe, yira. That's the verse says, Ivdu as Hashem b'yira, and that's the final conclusion. So we tried to explain that there is a connection between these two ideas. Number one, humility, and number two, awe or fear. Because if you have fear of Hashem or you have awe of Hashem, it will lead you to humility. It somehow goes hand in hand. You will feel humbled before Hashem. So the humility and the fear seem to go together, and that's how the simple understanding of the Gemara is fitting with Rashi, with Rashi's point of kavod reish means hachna'ah, a humility of feeling, a feeling of humility. Now, the Gemara then developed, tried to explain the conclusion of that verse, and we started explaining it over here, the Gilu Bera'ada, rejoice with trepidation, and we basically explained that this applies to weddings and other joyous occasions, that a person has to be careful not to go overboard. And Rashi uses the reason because it's Peirek oil, it's removing the yoke of heaven. A person should not remove the yoke of heaven. And the Rabbeinu Yoina, other commentaries emphasize that if a person it doesn't rejoice with trepidation, it will lead him to indulging in his passions and in the pleasures of the world, and he'll forget about Hashem. And so a person has to, even by time of rejoicing, it has to be balanced. It has to be there has to be an element of trepidation. And the Gemara gave a story, told us a story of a rabbi that broke an expensive vessel in order to
lessen the levity.
Thank you. Lessen the levity of the crowd. And Taisus mentioned that this is the custom that we have to break a glass at the wedding. And the commentaries mentioned that it seems that there's another reason why we break the glass at a wedding, and that is to remember the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And Taisus seems to be saying that the reason why we break a glass at a wedding is that we shouldn't lose ourselves and lessen the levity. And possibly they're connected. That how did this rabbi lessen the levity of the rejoicing? By reminding them of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So he reminded them of the destruction. It lessened their levity. Now we continue with that tradition. So the question is, so why do we break a glass that cost $1? This rabbi broke a glass that cost 400 zuz. That lessens the levity. And why do we break a glass that costs $1, that costs nothing? And the answer is not to be mevayish, not to embarrass those that couldn't afford an expensive glass. So our tradition is just to break a glass.
And now to sing Im Eshkechecha. You have to sing Im Eshkechecha right before you break the glass, because nobody knows otherwise what the glass. No, it's become a custom now. That's what they do.
Lately.
So you have a pause for a minute to stop and think about what you're doing, and then you go crazy.
Isaac is mentioning that there's a tradition lately that they sing a beautiful song about, if I forget Jerusalem, you should forget my right hand. And that, in other words, that Jerusalem is so important to me as much as my right hand is. And that song is commonly sang right when they break the glass by the chuppah.
That's lovely. That's lovely.
And so Isaac is saying the reason why they sing it is so that people connect the two points, that breaking of the glass is connected to the destruction of, reminding ourselves of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And that's right. That is why they sing it there. I don't know how much. I don't know when that tradition began, but it's definitely a nice song.
It is, because otherwise you don't hear really what's going on at the chuppah. I mean, you hear, you see, a mumble, a bracha, and then you hear a pause. Everyone knows it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. They break it, and everybody runs and screams. This, I think, is a beautiful thing where it actually stops everybody for a minute on whatever level and tells you why we're doing it. I think it's gorgeous.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very nice thing. But what you're saying is it's really connected to this Gemara, because we're talking about preparing ourselves for davening. Take a moment and prepare. So instead of just the chassan breaks the glass, we should actually think for a moment. We should think for a moment about it and about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So that
Rabbi, one more thing.
Yes.
I think also a point that I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I don't daven. But we don't want to just do something by rote every day and not think about what, in other words, just saying the words and going through the motions is not enough.
Okay.
Right.
So the Gemara continues, and it mentions other stories of this lessening the levity. And so we're on page 31a. Rav Ashi Avad Hilula. We're on the second line of 31a. Rav Ashi made a wedding, livrei, to his son. Chazinu l'Rabbanan davaka badchi tuva. He saw the rabbis; they were rejoicing too much. They were laughing too much. I see kasa dezugisa chibarta. He brought a cup of a white glass. The tavar kamayu, and he broke it in front of them biyatzivu, and they became saddened. Now, the commentaries mention that normally there's a prohibition of al tashlis. We're not allowed to destroy things. And how is this allowed to destroy glass at the wedding? And so they explain that because you're doing it with a purpose, that the purpose is that people should remember that that we shouldn't lose ourselves with our
Frivolity,
joyousness and frivolity, and so we should be more serious. So it's for a purpose, and therefore it's considered not a baltash, it's a destruction, but it's actually a positive thing. You're building with it. You're doing something positive by breaking the glass. And so that's why they did this. These rabbis did this. Amrule Rabbanan LaRav Hamnuna Zuti. The Hilula Demar Berei de Ravina. The rabbis told Rav Hamnuna Zuti in the Hilula, in the wedding of the son of Ravina, Lishrei Lan Mar, let master sing for us. Now, I'm not sure if Rav Hamnuna was had a very good voice. Maybe that's why they asked him to sing. That would be interesting if that art scroll has a page on Rav Hamnuna Zuti. But however it is, they asked him to sing. In Amar Lahu, so he said, and he started singing Vailon de Misnan, Vailon de Misnan. Woe is to us that we will die. Woe is to us that we will die. So what we're seeing is the same idea, that he wanted to lessen the levity, and therefore he reminded people of death. So Amri Le Anan Manani Basrach. So they told Rav Hamnuna Zuti, they said, what should we answer after you as a refrain, as what should we sing after you? In other words, your statement is very powerful. And what should we say after you? So Amar Le, Hai Torah v'Hai Mitzvah demignu alon. Where is the Torah that we learned and the mitzvahs that we fulfilled, that it would protect us from the judgment of hell? So that was at the wedding of Mar Berei de Ravina, the son of Ravina, and they had a little song there to lessen the levity. This song about death, and where is where are our Torah, where is our mitzvahs that will protect us? Like, we don't, do we have enough? Do we really have Torah and mitzvahs that will protect us? Do we have? So the rabbis, the commentaries explain that even though it's not really appropriate at a wedding to mention death, but because one of the concepts of a wedding is to continue to populate the world, and if not for death, there wouldn't really be a need for a wedding, because the world would continue to be populated. Only because of death is there a need for, do we need future generations? And so somehow, because of that, it sort of explains that it's not so out of place to mention death at a wedding, because that's sort of connected to a wedding. The fact that there is death causes us to need to repopulate the world, as Hashem wants the world to be populated, and therefore it wasn't, so to speak, out of place to mention death at a wedding. The Gemara continues, and it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan says, in the name of Reb Shimon ben Yochai, Asur liyadam sheyamale schok piv ba'ilam hazeh. It's prohibited for a person to fill his mouth with frivolity in this world. Shenemar, as it says, Oz yamale schok pinu. Then our mouths will be filled with schok, with joking and frivolity. Then, only then, Ula shaynenu rina, and our tongues will have song upon them. So only then, when Mashiach comes, Amosai, when will that be? As the verse continues, Bizman sheyomru bagoyim higdel Hashem la'asei semela, in the time that the goyim, they will be said amongst the nations, Hashem did great with these people, with the Jewish people. That's when we can be yemale schok pinu, our mouths can be filled with joking and frivolity and levity and joyousness. But until then, we're not allowed to fill our mouths with this type of behavior. We say this is the Tehillim, the psalm that we say before the benching on holidays, on Shabbos and holidays, Rosh Chodesh. Oz Yamali Schleik Pino Sharnino Rina, and that Higdal Hashem Lasis Oz Yom Goyim Higdal Hashem Lasis Mela. So we recite this psalm, which it's especially connected to Shabbos because Shabbos is the foretaste of when Mashiach is going to come and when we will be able to have this type of rejoicing. Amru Olav al Reish Lakish. They said about Reish Lakish, who was a rabbi of the Talmud, a brother-in-law to Rabbi Yochanan. They said about him, Shemiyamav lo'imilei schayk piv ba'ilam hazeh, that in all his days, Michishama me Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi, once he heard from Rabbi Yochanan, his Rebbe. Rabbi Yochanan was his brother-in-law and his Rebbe. And once he heard this teaching from him, he never filled his mouth with schayk in this world. Once he heard this teaching. And the question, of course, is, of course, he's not going to do that. His Rebbe told him not to. Why would you think he would? I mean, he was a great rabbi in the Talmud. Why would you think he would ever do such a thing? What does the Gemara have to tell us this for? Yes, Ben.
I want to say, I think he mentioned death because the level of schok maleh schok pinu was getting too high. He just wanted to tone it down. He just wanted to tone it down. He didn't want to stop it, but he wanted to tone it down.
No, for sure. I think the commentary that mentions that insight is more surprised that you would even mention the word death at a wedding. It just is not. He understood that he was lessening the levity, but he felt that, is it really appropriate to mention, death at a wedding? And he says, yeah, it actually the concept of a wedding is because of death. But yes, you're correct that it was really to lessen their not to stop their rejoicing, just to balance it, limit it a drop.
Rabbi, could I add something? Also, sure. Obviously, when you get married to someone, everyone wants to know: are you going to have children? Are you going to, And so maybe by mentioning death at a wedding is not so inappropriate because you want your people to carry on. Right. It gives them the feeling of responsibility to have children and not to start with their family planning, Goyish idea of family planning. Correct.
Rabbi.
Okay. Yes.
I want to use a rather crude version of what we're talking about is in the movie Fiddler on the Roof, okay? Where, the pogroms are taking place during a simcha, and I don't know whether that was too much celebration or too much excitement, but you noticed how they came in on horses, the Cossacks, and they attacked the people who were celebrating during the simcha, you know what I'm saying? I don't know if you ever saw the movie. It's not a realistic depiction, I think, of what really was going on in the shtetls, but maybe over exaggerated, but yet it does make a point. I think that kind of thing was actually, did happen during, in Russia at that time. Are you familiar with the scene? I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're bringing from it. I mean.
No, I'm just saying there was too much simcha. Apparently, there's too much celebration, too much shikar, and as a result, you brought in outside sources that came in to rectify the situation. You know what I'm saying? Maybe that's what they were afraid of in those days. Maybe it would lead to something like that.
Right. I don't think the people who made the movie had that in mind, but that's an interesting thought that came to your mind. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Yes, Ben.
Yeah, I don't think at the time they wrote the Talmud they were thinking about the shtetl, but shtetls were
or Fiddler on the Roof.
They were not. Shtetls were only in Russia. They were not in the rest of the countries where Jews were living. So
no, there could have been pogroms.
Simcha, you have to teach people, not just in the shtetl. You have to teach all the Jews, No,
I think he has a point that there were definitely pogroms. I mean, they had the exile, they lived through terrible times. Sure. There definitely could have been such tsaras, which I think what you're saying is also that the not necessarily that it's because they rejoice too much, it causes it, but people should realize that life is so short and that it's important to, get married and have children and so on. You can't, the time is not waiting for you, time is ticking. So I think that's an idea here as well. Okay, so in any event, we have this statement that Reish Lakish. Now, Reish Lakish said that once I heard this law, I always followed it. They said about him that in his lifetime, since he heard it from his Rebbe, he followed this teaching. And the question is, what is that? Why is it mentioning that? And so one of the commentaries, Ben Yoda, explains that Reish Lakish was naturally a joker, a badchan. That was who he was. He naturally had he was what you call a badchan, a comedian, stand-up comedian. And for him, this was a huge statement, a huge stand that he took, that even though his nature was to be a joker, he made sure, once he heard this teaching from his Rebbe, he made sure not to ever fill his mouth with schoik in this world, because he didn't want to transgress this law that it's usher for a person to fill his mouth with schoik in this world, and he followed what his Rebbe taught, even though it went totally against his nature. So I don't know if this means you can't go to a comedy show, but I guess there's a limit how much a person should let themselves enjoy that type of stuff, especially nowadays where comedy is generally many of the comedy shows have nivel ped, really dirty language and so on. But it seems even so, like there should be some type of a limit as to to what it means. Yemale schaitiv. I mean, it's a vague law. What does it mean? You can't fill your mouth with schaik. What does it mean, fill your mouth? So that's a little unclear. Let's see. It's brought in the law, chapter 560 of the Shulchan Aruch. Let me pull up a Shulchan Aruch here.
By the way, I sent you Rav Hamnuna, and naturally there are two, and the way to tell them apart, I think, is by looking at who you're discussing with them. So if you look at the Gemara with the names that are mentioned there, you can figure out which one of the two. But they were both great people.
So one was a second generation Amoira, contemporary of Rav Huna, and the other one is a third generation Amoira, lived in the times of Rabbah and Rav Yosef. I'm just wondering if it mentions anything about singing. Why did they ask him to sing? So I was thinking maybe he had a good voice, or it was just like common for them to ask.
I guess not chazan quality to put on the resume, but
right. That's what I'm wondering. So you didn't see it there. You read through it. Okay. Okay. Well, great.
Rabbi,
okay. Thank you. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment. You were talking about the comedians nowadays have used inappropriate language. And it used to bother me a lot, the languages that, and also in talking with people, the language is really difficult for me to get through because I don't come from that generation.
Right.
And the problem I feel is that people have gone too far and they need to get someone's attention. So they use language to get your attention. But beyond that, to me, I want to hear what a person is really saying. I almost need a translator.
Right. So
if you know what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So in any event, we don't want to give explanations for those people, but that's the point is
number one, from looking at the bottom of page 1 going to 2,
yeah,
and the way they describe in Brochos later about how he explains Shemayna Esra and everything else, I would guess number 1.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well,
he's the one who taught us Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim.
No, but
He
I'm
made
wondering
that
if we're calling him Rab Hamnuna Zuti, wouldn't that mean he's the young one? I think that would mean he's the
maybe
young
number
one.
2 was older.
In the Steinsaltz, it says Hakatan.
Yeah, so what would that mean?
Hakatan.
I would think
the young one.
The young one would mean the one in a later generation.
Yeah, the Katan is young.
So they probably lived together in the same time. And that's why they called one the young one. That's my guess, but I may be wrong. But I'm just. Oh no! It mentions. I'm sorry. It mentions in note 30 there was also an earlier Rav Hamnuna in the times of Rebbe who is mentioned in the Yerushalmi Tainus, and there he is called Rav Hamnuna the Babylonian. He was a teacher of Rav Chanina Bar Chama. But that the question would be, why would they call this Rav Hamnuna Zuti if
and that's the wedding of his son Rav. So he was
maybe
the father of Rav.
To
Maybe
his
it's a nickname?
contemporaries, he may have been the young one.
And not Rav.
yeah, that could be. It could be. Yeah, could be. Okay,
Rav.
Isaac has a good point that it could be that he was just young compared to his to the other people there, and that's why maybe they asked him to sing. Okay, yeah, it could be because we see that it's the wedding of the son of Ravina. Ravina lived in the same time as Rav Ashi, and later, so they were. No, but that would. It would seem like he must be the later, because if this is the wedding of Ravina and Rav Ashi, they were at the end of the Talmud. So I think the later one would make sense. This is the son of Ravina. According to that, I think
he lives in the times of Rabbah, so that would be number 2.
Yeah, number 2.
I said you have to look at who the Gemara refers to alongside with him, and you'll figure it out.
Right. Okay. Well,
but
in any event,
the question of why they picked him to sing, I think they knew that he would tone it down. Because Lemale Pinu Rina and singing, you're not leaving room for any godliness or anything else.
But why
you're
him?
Overwhelmed with the happiness, and that's it. So they wanted somebody to tone it down. They knew that he will sing something that will tone it down, not because of his voice.
Right. Okay. Maybe. It could be.
Good point, Ben. Good point.
It's possible. Okay, so in Shulchan Aruch, it brings this law, but it also doesn't clarify to what extent. It just says it's asur la'adam. It's prohibited for a person to yamale schoik piv schoik ba'ilam hazeh. In this world, prohibited to fill your mouth with laughter in this world. And the commentaries mention that that's even at a wedding or on Purim. So there has to be some type of a limit, I guess. It shouldn't be unlimited. I guess that would be the meaning.
It shouldn't
Now,
get out of hands.
shouldn't get out of hands. Yes.
I'm curious about something, Rabbi. Is there always a lot of alcohol at a Jewish wedding?
Oh, yeah.
No.
I don't think so. To me anyway, I mean, I don't go to a lot of weddings right now. I'm very old and I don't know a lot of young people, you know.
Right. No, it's not necessarily from the drinking. It's from the excitement. You're so happy that someone got married. People lose
You
their
should be
seriousness.
relieved. In other words, you should be relieved that somebody finally got married. Is that
Yeah, people are so excited. It's such a time of rejoicing that when you're with your friends and you're so happy, it could cause a person to forget about the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and get involved, and rejoice a little too much and so on. Now, this chapter where it mentions this law in the Shulchan Aruch is about to do things to remember the Churban. So it's interesting that in that chapter it says that it's prohibited to fill one's mouth with rejoicing in this world, meaning that it seems like it's because of we have to remember the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and that's what the Gemara seems to say, that only then, when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, that's when we will be able to have rejoicing. We will be able to truly be like unlimited joyousness because the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt. Oz Yamalis Chaytinu, and that will be when the nations of the world, when they say how great Hashem is for doing kindness to the Jewish people.
Rabbi,
So, yes.
do we have to wait till there's peace in Israel?
Well,
Is that
it
what-
really refers to the coming of Mashiach. So
Okay.
it's not,
It's not
not
okay.
like some false peace process or all this
Latest-
nonsense that
Latest ceasefire. Yeah.
yeah, it's not short, nothing short. We're talking about long-term stuff, real stuff, not people who lie.
We're waiting for our
and,
Messiah. That's-
we're not dealing with we're not dealing with political peace. We're dealing
Okay.
with
How are we
peace.
going to recognize the Messiah?
Come on a donkey.
You will know. You will know. You will know. So the Gemara continues, and it says, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned, Ein oimdim lehispalel, a person should not get up to daven, lo miteich din, not from a court case, v'lo miteich dvar halacha, not from learning a area of Jewish law, ela mitoich halacha pesuka, but rather a person should get up to daven from a halacha pesuka, a clear law. So what the Gemara is telling us is that person is supposed to daven with the right frame of mind. And the Gemara says that it wouldn't be appropriate to daven with judging a case, because you're involved in very intricate laws. When you have to judge a case, or even if it doesn't mean a court case, but you're just looking into the depth of a din of a law, and not or monetary law, and not involved in a halachic law, but rather something that's clear, that doesn't need depth of thought. In this way, you won't, while you're davening, you won't end up thinking about it. Now, the commentaries try to they try to understand, is this telling you should learn a halacha, learn a law that's clear before you daven? Or is it saying that if you are learning before you're davening, you should have, the learning should only be laws that are very simple and easy, and you won't have to, during the davening, you won't be thinking about these complicated laws. So again, we mentioned in the Brisa here that a person should not be involved in complicated laws before they daven, but only involved in a halacha pesuka, a clear law. And the commentaries are wondering, what does that really mean? Does it mean you should do that, or it's allowed to do that? Is that what you should do? And it seems from Rashi that when it says later that the commentaries seem to, well, they debate about Rashi, actually. They debate what Rashi holds. Does Rashi hold you should do this, or it's allowed? We'll see further. I'll show you the Rashi when we get up to it. In any event, this is easy to say, but what does this mean? What is a clear halacha? So the Gemara gives examples. Vehechi dami halacha pesuka. What is a clear halacha that doesn't need to be thought about, meditated upon, and that will not cause someone to think about it during davening? What is such a case? So the Gemara gives examples. Kihad Reb Zera, like the statement of Reb Zera, the Amar Reb Zera, that Reb Zera says, B'nais Yisrael achmiru al atzman, the daughters of Israel, they took a stringency upon themselves. Sha'afilu royais tipas dam kechardel, even if they saw a drop of blood like a mustard seed, Yoshevas aleha shiva nikiyim, they wait 7 clean days. Now, this is not a law that the Torah states. This is a stringency that women took upon themselves. And because of that, there's not arguments about it. It's pretty straightforward. What is the law? The law is that normally a woman who menstruates is a nida, and she's a nida for 7 days. So it doesn't matter how long she bleeds, if she bleeds 3 days or 5 days or 7 days, but after the 7 days is over, as long as she stopped bleeding, she would now be allowed to go to mikvah. She does not need, according to biblical law, 7 clean days. She could go to mikvah straight after her menstruation. However, there's another law that talks about another type of impurity for a woman, and that's called zava or ziva. And that law has to do, if she sees blood 3 days in a row, not during her nida days, but when she's not at the time of not during her menstrual cycle, but let's say in between 2 menstrual cycles, she sees blood for 3 days in a row, she would be a zava gedola, and she would need to have 7 clean days till she's pure to touch holy items and to be with her husband and so on. So because of these 2 laws, one law of menstruation laws of impurity and the other law of zava laws of impurity, they could be very confusing because one obligates 7 clean days, and the other one doesn't obligate 7 clean days, but it just obligates 7 days. And what happens if a person messes up their calculation? And so really they're in the middle of their in between menstrual cycles, and therefore they would really need 7 clean days. And instead, there could be mistakes that happen. And because of that, the women decided that they're going to take a stringency upon themselves, and that became law. Now it's a law for all of the Jewish people that from the time of the Talmud, that anytime a woman sees blood, she has to wait 7 clean days. Of course, there are situations where you know where the blood is coming from and it's not coming from the uterus or so. There could be exceptions to the rule where you could get of course, you would need a rabbi that specializes in the laws of dam, the laws of bleeding. There are rabbis that specialize in this, called maros. They specialize in what the actual color of the blood, and they could tell, and so on. They could just figure out the situation. But under normal circumstances, the women have accepted upon themselves the stringency to always count 7 clean days before they go to mikvah. And that stringency, that law, is called a halacha pesuka. That's an example of a law that's very simple. There's no arguing about it because it's something that the women accepted on themselves. So if it was something that you derive from the Torah, and there could be different opinions and understanding, different explanations and so on, different ways of understanding it. But here it's something that they accepted upon themselves and there's no arguments about it. So it's called a halacha psuka, and that would be the appropriate halacha that a person could daven while after learning that halacha. So now, the reason why it mentions, even if they see a small amount of blood, even the size of a mustard seed, is because really even a small amount of blood is considered tameh, impure. So what does it matter? Why does it emphasize this idea? Why does it mention this idea that even a mustard seed size of blood? Are you watching the baby? Okay. Why would it mention that? And so the Gemara says, the commentaries explain, because the laws of Ziva, the laws of Zava would obligate, would only apply if a person saw blood 3 days in a row. And to see 3 dots of blood 3 days in a row, you would need 3 dots of blood. And if it's so small that it only looks like 1 dot of blood, so you might think that maybe a woman would not need to count 7 clean days, because Zava Gedola, the law of counting 7 clean days, only applies if she saw blood, 3 drops each day, or a drop each day, 3 days in a row. So the Gemara says that the term that the law states is even a mustard size drop of blood that's so tiny. Nevertheless, that all the women have accepted the stringency upon themselves that they don't just go to mikvah, but they wait 7 clean days, no matter what the type of blood it is, no matter how long they saw the blood, and even a drop of blood, they'll wait 7 clean days. That means that they check themselves 7 days in a row to make sure that they're not bleeding at all, and then they would go to mikvah, and that would be one example of a halacha psuka. Now comes the next example. Any questions on that? Okay. The next example is Rava Amar Ki Hada Rav Hoshia. Rava says an example is like the statement of Rav Hoshia. The Amar Rav Hoshia says, a person can act sly with his grain, can sort of do a little trick with his grain. What is the trick that he does? He can umachnisa b'moitz shala. He can bring the grain into his house without straightening up the pile of grain. In other words, if he didn't winnow it yet and straighten the pile after winnowing, and he just brings the grain into his house while it still has the mites, which is the chaff is still on the grain, a person would be able to allow then his animal to eat from the grain, and he wouldn't have to take Meiser he would be exempt from taking Meiser and allow the animal to eat the grain. And this is a sort of a way of circumventing the law of taking Meiser. A person normally would be obligated to remove a tithe for a percentage for the kohen, for the Levi, and so on. But if a person, the normal way that was done is if you did it, in other words, that obligation falls only if you did it in the normal way. But here you sort of did things in an abnormal way, and therefore you've exempted yourself from the full obligation, the full obligation of taking Meiser, at least biblically. And it comes out that there is a leniency that you would be allowed to have your animal eat from this because it's called achilas arai. It's called a temporary eating. In other words, a person would not be allowed to eat a full-fledged meal, but they would be allowed to grab something temporarily from it. And an animal, all of the eating of an animal is called temporary. Because of that, this would be an exemption where a person could let their animal eat from this grain without separating the Meiser, the tithings, Truma and Meiser from it. And so this was a law that everyone agreed with. It's because the Torah seems to only obligate you once you bring it into your house after it was done in the normal way. And because of that, it ends up that this is an example of a law that there's no argument about. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say it's interesting that they use the word ma'arim by piling up the thing, because ma'arim is also not on the straight and narrow. You're kind of cheating.
Right.
So you're not going to pay the maser on it.
It uses that term whenever a person does something that's a little
out of the ordinary.
A little, slightly cheating. It uses the term ma'arim. It doesn't mean that they're lying, because they're not. This is within the framework of the laws. It fits within the laws. In other words,
that's true, but I'm just interested in the word that they picked, ma'arim, instead of piling up,
Right. Yeah, but not now. Almost done. Yeah, it uses that term because, you see, you have to understand that, when it comes to taxation law, so the reason why there are loopholes in the taxation law is because the people who write the laws didn't discuss it with the lawyers who find loopholes. And because of that, they never cover all the loopholes. So there's always loopholes in the law because the people who write the law are hired by the government. They're not necessarily the most, experts in making sure there's no loopholes. And the lawyers' jobs are to find all the loopholes, and therefore there's a good business of finding loopholes. When it comes to Torah, it's the exact opposite. Hashem knows every single loophole that's possible. He wrote the Torah exactly how he wanted to do it. And when there is a loophole, it's because Hashem allows this. This is allowed. Now, it's allowed. It is permissible. The rabbis sometimes add a certain stringency and certain laws to these type of cases, but this is a case that it's according to law. This is allowed. But nevertheless, the Gemara uses the word ma'arim because you are somehow circumventing the general rule. Okay, I think someone had a question. Did anyone have? Susan, did you have a question? Someone? Okay, I guess not.
Yes, I did. What are you talking about?
In the land of Israel, there's an obligation to separate percentages of a person's produce. So it doesn't apply here.
Okay.
But it actually does apply outside of Israel, that you have to be careful not to buy food grown in Israel. Normally we think we want to give business to Israel. We should buy Israeli products. That's true. It's very nice to buy Israeli products, but there is one exception, and that is fruits and vegetables. If you find out that your store is selling peppers from Israel or cucumbers or something from Israel, don't buy it. And the reason is because it's too complicated to deal with the laws of separating the tithings. And because of that, it's better, so very complicated laws. It could even be Shemitah this coming year, could other laws. So better don't buy fruit or vegetables that come from Israel unless it's a canned item that's from Israel and it has a kosher symbol on it. If it's canned, like for example, they sell a lot of pickles from Israel or other canned foods from Israel that are fruits or vegetables, that would be allowed if it has a kosher symbol on it, because that means that the rabbis that supervised it, they made sure to cover all the issues. But other than that, the one exception, normally it's great to give business to people in Israel, but that would be one exception, is the fact that they're sending the produce here and it becomes too complicated to deal with. But so normally the person would be obligated to separate certain tithes and before they feed their animal, but there are cases where you could even bring it into your house and you would be able to, your animal would be exempt from giving Meiser, would be able to eat it. Okay, and that was the second example. And then the Gemara comes to a third example.
Rabbi,
yes.
Rabbi, I had a question. Yes. I don't know if this is a silly question or not, but I'm just noticing it says that previously it said Abaya says this is like Rab Zera, and then it repeats Rab Zera said. Then in this Gemara, this piece, it says this is like Rab Yishaya, as Rab Yishaya says. And in the next Gemara, it's going to say this is like the Rav Huna, and Rav Huna says. So why are they saying the repetition of the person's name? Why don't they just say this is like Rav Huna who said? So 3 times in a row here, they're repeating the rabbi's name. So I'm just wondering why that is, or if there is a reason.
So the reason is we're sort of bringing a quotation from another place. And the quotation in the other place includes the rabbi's name. And so like the Gemara about Nida is in the Tractate Nida. So we're taking that entire piece, that entire statement. So the Gemara here is saying, this is like the statement of Reb Zera. And then the Gemara says, and let me give you the quotation. Reb Zera says that the women of Israel accepted upon themselves. So we're bringing Gemaras from other places, and we're just bringing that entire statement. And here we're just calling it, and these rabbis were given, that's the Reb Zera statement. This is the Reb Hoshea statement, and then it brings it from that other source. So that would be why it does that. It's not surprising. It does that often. Good question. So the final example that the Gemara gives of a halacha psuka, again, we're talking about davening after learning a clear-cut halacha. So the final example is Rav Huna, like the statement of Rav Huna, the Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Zera, Hamek is dam bebehemas kachim, if a person draws blood from a holy animal, an animal that was set aside as a sacrifice. It's called a behemas kachim, but it wasn't sacrificed yet. It's asur bahana. You're not allowed to benefit from that blood. Umayalin boy, and the law is that if a person benefits from that blood, how would you benefit from the blood? So they use the blood sometimes for fertilizer. Maybe people, I don't know, in the olden days, people drank blood. But the law is that if a person took let blood from the animal, and this animal was set aside as a sacrifice, this would be a problem, and it would be prohibited. It would be included in the laws of Me'ilah, that you're benefiting, misappropriating the items of the Beis Hamikdash, using it for unholy things, and that would be inappropriate. That would be a prohibition. It would be Me'ilah. Me'ilah is a sacrifice a person would have to bring for doing this. You would have to go and bring another sacrifice called an Asham Me'ilais, a certain sacrifice for doing Me'ilah, because you're benefiting from the holies. So this would be another example of a benefit of a law that's clear and doesn't have any arguments. This concludes our class. Yes, Moshe, you have a question? Yeah.
What about the